Well, good morning, WellSpring. We're excited that you're here. I'm personally just honored that you're here as we jump into this new series today. You have come on an important day. I really do believe that, and I'll explain that more in just a second. To those of you who are watching online, you've come on an important day as well. From the living room in your jammies or wherever you might be finding this or watching it on your phone or something later, welcome to you. Also, glad that you're here. We're starting a brand new series today called the Book of Ruth. And we're going to get to that in a minute because I'm excited about what God's going to do with that. But before we do that, let me give you just a snippet of where we are as a church. So if you've had other things going on in your life and you've not been thinking about this all week like I have, I'll bring you up to speed. Or if you've not been with us, we'll bring you up to speed. Either way, what we're going to happen over the next couple of weeks. So you'll see on the screen there, if you want to go ahead and throw that up, Dan, or the next couple of weeks, we're going to be praying for our community, for our world, really. So next week, we're going to pray for our schools, and there'll be baskets out in the lobby, and each basket will represent a school. So there'll be a basket for Longview, and a basket for Summit, and a basket for Marvin Wright, and a basket for all the different schools in our area. And if you have a student in one of those schools, you can go up to that basket and draw one or more names of teachers, administrators, aides. All of that will be in the different baskets. Or if you don't have a student connected to one of those schools, just go and get one of each. I mean, that's fine too. We'd love for you to do that. And we're going to pray by name for every school official, every educator in our community. And so we're going to need some of you to take more, like today, we're praying for government stuff. We'll talk about that in a second. There's like 600 and some odd names we're praying for today by name, in addition to the president and vice president. And so we're going to need you guys to take more than one of those probably to make that work. If you're watching online, you can text in or comment in on the app on the Facebook feed, and we'll get you a name there as well. So we're going to pray for every name. But next week, it's like double the number because we have a lot of schools in the area, and so we're going to need you to pray for that. The following week, 2 weeks from now, we're going to pray for every home in our community. And there's a map outside in the lobby that you can highlight a section of road. And we're asking you don't just take a whole big section and not really pray for it. We want you to pray by family, each house, for every home in the community. So if you have friends, you can let them know in 2 weeks. We're praying for them, whether they know it or not, or invite or not. We're going to pray for them by name or by family, by house. And we'll need you to sign up for some houses as well, or the staff and I are going to have a long Monday walk in the community. So we're going to need you to do that. Some of you who are prayer warriors over these next few weeks, we need you to kick in a little heavier and do more of that. Today, we're going to be praying for every government official, federal, state, and local. To give you an example of that, I went and pulled one out this morning. So the person I'm praying for today is Kristen Parker, who's Murray County School Board District 1 member, and I'll be praying for Kristen all day today. And you can go grab, again, 1 or 2 or 8 or 9 would be great if some of you did that. And I want you to pray by name for them. Some of them we don't know yet. There's some House districts and even a couple Senate races we don't know who's going to win. So we just put both names in. And so we're going to pray for both of them. One of them wins, one of them loses, but we're going to pray for both of them. I said ahead of time, we're going to pray for the president, whoever they might be. Some of you, it was called yesterday for President-elect Biden, so everybody needs to pray for them. Some of you I know are concerned that it may still be up and going. You can pray for both names there as well. Trump is still the president. Biden has been elected apparently, so you can pray for both of those, and that will be great. We'd like for all of us to pray for the president-elect, and then each of you get a name or two from the basket on the way out. Now, but speaking of prayer, this was not included in last service's message. I don't know about next service's message, we'll see. I try to be really sensitive to spiritual things, especially on Sunday. So I got spidey senses out, trying to pay attention to what God might be up to. And you may believe in that stuff, I do. You may not believe in that stuff, and that's okay. We can disagree, and you can be wrong, and I'll still love you. But you can do that. I try to pay attention to that sort of thing. And I got to tell you, I don't know what it is, but God's got in mind for somebody to get something today. Whether you're here or whether you're online, I don't know, but something's going to happen today. I'm convinced of that. So if you're a prayer, I want you to pray. Take a second and pray about that. If you missed the first few minutes of the message, come on back. I'll join you here in a second. Barry said a minute ago, as I was sitting on the front row, just kind of antsy to get this started because, again, I feel like something's, and he said, we want you to be comfortable. And that's true. We do. We don't want to do anything I don't want to do anything that makes you feel uncomfortable. We don't want to do anything that makes you feel uncomfortable. But if God makes you feel uncomfortable, I'm okay with that. And so you can pray about that as well, and you and God can wrestle through that, okay? All right, we're going to jump in the book of Ruth today, and I'm going to start with the very first verse to give everybody an update on where we're at. So if you know the story, this will be a refresher. If you don't know the story, that's fine. You can walk along with us in this series and get a lot out of that. Ruth 1:1 says, in the days when the judges judged, there was a famine in the land. Now that's an interesting phrase, in the days when the judges judged. He's not just describing a time period. He's doing that for sure. This is the time period of when that happened, when there was judges. But he's also kind of giving you a mood of the climate of the time. It'd be like if today we said in the days when Martin Luther King preached. You know a time period, you can get the year pretty close, but you also get a sense of what was going on in the surroundings, the kind of temperature. Or like in the days when we stormed the beaches of Normandy. You get a date there, but you also get a mood of the world and what was going on. Like a Colts fan might say in the days when Peyton Manning played, and just kind of a moment there together. You know the time period, and you notice he's not wearing a Bronco thing. Like it's the time period, but you also get a sense of the climate of that. So when the writer here says, in the days when the judges judged, they're giving you a time period, but also a climate. Ruth's story, if you know the Old Testament, Ruth's story is kind of a bridge between the time of the judges, comes kind of the tail end of that, and leads into the time of the kings. Ruth was David's great-grandma, so it all kind of ties in there historically in the middle. Now to give you an idea of what that climate is like, Judges 21:25, the last verse of that book says, in those days Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit. Some translations say as they saw fit in their own eyes. I think what you're going to notice is the world Ruth lived in many ways is similar to the world we live in, where an increasing number of people want to do what seems right in their own eyes, and it doesn't work very well. Ruth lived in a time of political instability, like us, a time of fear and anxiety, like us, a time of unrest and disorder, much like us. But hers is a little more specific and troublesome. Let me read a little further. It says, in the days when the judges judged or ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi. The names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. So on top of the political instability and on top of the immoral nature of the culture, now they've got a famine. And if you're not familiar with ancient times, famines were different then. They had no rain for a period. Our day when you have no rain, you can't water your grass, or you've got to wash your car on Tuesday or something. It's so dreadful if you have no water. In those days, if you had no water, crops didn't grow. If crops don't grow, you move or you starve, and your kids starve. So this was crisis situation. And so because of the famine, Naomi and Elimelech and their 2 boys moved from Bethlehem to the nation of Moab. It gets worse. It's like 2020 for Ruth. Ruth 1 says, now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons, and they married Moabite women. That's the area they were living in. One named Orpah and the other Ruth. Notice it's not Oprah, it's Orpah. And if I get through all day without saying Oprah, I will have succeeded. So that's a bucket list for me, Orpah. Now it's subtle, but you kind of get the ages of Naomi here. And I think this is important. Like Elimelech dies, Naomi's husband, prior to Naomi's sons and Elimelech's sons getting married. Do you see that? So Elimelech dies, Chilion marries Orpah, Mahlon marries Ruth, which means that Naomi at this point, when they moved, was a fairly young woman. Very likely she was about my age. So as I said, a fairly young, vibrant woman, right? Now, it goes bad worse. They had to move because of the famine. Elimelech dies. It says, verse 4 says, after they had lived there about 10 years, so 10 years after Elimelech dies and they had moved, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, her sons, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons, without her husband. Now, this is terrible. In those days, a woman wasn't able to provide for herself like in many ways she can today. There's a lot more equality today, but in those days, if you weren't attached to a man, your father, your husband, your sons, you were in trouble financially. And we don't know what happened to the boys, her sons. The Bible doesn't tell us. It seems like they died at the same time, so maybe it was an accident. So this is just going from bad to worse. The famine, Elimelech dies, her sons die, maybe a terrible accident. Here you have Naomi, a woman of faith, a God-honoring, God-following person living in a foreign country, no family around, lost her husband, lost her boys. She feels completely alone, completely responsible, not only for her welfare, but for theirs. And you may know what that's like. As things in your life get stripped away and you're left with less and less to provide for more and more need. And that's how she felt. And again, many of you probably get that. And if I'm being candid, like I just step back and call a timeout on this, I look at this and say, if I'm Naomi, I'm saying, God, you're not doing your part. I'm holding up my end of the bargain. I'm trying to follow you. I'm a woman of faith. I'm trying to be honoring in the way I live my life, and yet you're not doing your part. It seems like that to me. Do you ever feel like that? Like there's a lot of irony in the text. The way the text is written has a lot of irony. Let me just give you some pictures there. Naomi's husband is named Elimelech. Names meant a lot in those days. Elimelech means God is king. So this is a God-honoring family. And they're from Bethlehem, which means place of bread, and yet they had to move because of a famine. Like, do you see the irony here? They're honoring God as king, and yet they had to move because the famine drives them from this place of bread. Like, there's just a lot of thick irony there. Where's God at? What's he up to? Like, I think the author's wanting us to get some not so subtle hints that there's a lot of disappointment towards God here. So Naomi tells Orpah and Ruth that she's going to go home. Like, I got to get back to around some family. But you guys aren't from Bethlehem. You're from here. I don't have any more boys. Once you go home and get married again. So Orpah does, long story short. But Ruth says, no, I'm staying with you. And then she says to Naomi these iconic words. Says, Ruth said, entreat me not to leave thee or to return from following after thee, for whither thou goest, I will go. And where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, thy God, my God. Where thou diest, will I die, and there I will be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me. And the Hebrew wedding planners were off to the side writing that down, going, that is great. We're going to use that in a ceremony. The fact that she spoke the king's English just made it better. I mean, that's great. We're going to write that down. That was funnier. I mean, come on, for heaven's sake. Anyway, I'm trying up here. I believe Naomi, by the way, is aware of the name thing. You know, we talk about Elimelech and Bethlehem. I think Naomi's aware of the name deal because when they go back to Bethlehem, Ruth and Naomi, she's been gone like a decade. She left with a husband and 2 boys. She's coming back now with just a daughter-in-law. Everyone else is gone. And when she comes back, the town folks say, is that Naomi? Which I think is a nice way of saying she's aged more than 10 years in the 10 years she's been gone. And I mean, think about it. She has. If you move with 2 teenage boys and come back and your husband and both boys are dead, that's been a tough 10 years. You're like, is that Naomi? In Ruth 1:20, Naomi says, don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara because the Lord, the Almighty, has made my life very bitter. Naomi means pleasant, but she's changed her name to bitter. She's saying, I'm not who I once was. I left here pleasant. I'm returning bitter. The Almighty has made me bitter. Now, some of you have gone from pleasant to bitter. You know what that's like. You've done that transition, maybe recently, and you know what it's like to have been pleasant, but now to find yourself bitter. And maybe like Naomi, you're saying, I don't know how I got here on this road. This is not the plan I chose for myself. Some things have gone wrong, some dead ends, some U-turns, but here I am, and now I'm bitter, and I'm sort of blaming God for that. I'm definitely not who I once was, and I think I'm kind of mad that God's let me get here. So what do you do when you're mad at God? Like, that's an important thing to talk about in church, I think. What do you do when you're mad at God? Now, before you dismiss that, I think churches are tempted to dismiss that. The Bible mentions it a lot because it's a real thing. There's a lot of things in this world that can be disappointing, and it's easy to point our finger at God. So the Bible talks about it a lot. Jonah was mad at God because God didn't destroy Nineveh, and Jonah said that he would. Elijah was mad at God. He went through a drought. He faced the prophets of Baal. He defeated all of them, and then got rewarded by a death threat from Ahab. And it was just one more thing, last straw. And now he's mad at God. And some of you know what it's like to have a last straw. Like you were fighting and you're fighting and you're fighting and you're making it and you're doing things. And then there's that one more thing. It's just too much. Elijah gets that one more thing, mad at God. Abraham was mad at God because God said he's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham's nephew lived there. And he's like, God, what are you doing? In fact, he pled with God in Genesis 18 and said, won't the judge of the whole earth do what is right? Now, he didn't say God wasn't doing what is right, but you can kind of read between the lines there. Have you ever wondered, God, are you not going to do what's right? Here's the clear path, God. Let's all go this direction, and yet you're going over here. And Abraham is mad at God, saying, why aren't you going to do what's right? And I think Naomi gets that. And I'm guessing we get that. You get that, right? There's a lot of things to be mad at God about. a lot of things to be disappointed with God about. And when we do, I think it's because we've misunderstood some things. The Bible says, and my life confirms, that God is a wise, good leader. He's a good judge. He knows how to make things work. He's always right. He's always good. He's always kind and always loving. But in this life, sometimes it's hard to see that. And in this life, we can think we're going this way and God ought to be over here, and yet God seems to be over there. And in the moment, we think, God, you're in the wrong place. You're not being good and kind and loving. And yet, you'll realize eventually, no, he was in the right spot all along. But we've misunderstood some things. And I want to take 3 common misunderstandings and use the bulk of our time to unpack some of those. Because if you can get these misunderstandings cleared up in your life, you're going to see things differently. I think the way we'll see Naomi and Ruth do over these next few weeks. Misunderstanding number 1 is that our world is not broken. So you think, well, everything should be fine because our world's, it's right, it's good. Jesus tells us that one day he's going to restore all things. In Revelation, it says that in that day, there will be no more death, no more mourning, no more crying or pain, because the old order of things will have passed away. But today's not that day. Today's a day where things they've not been restored, and there still is mourning and death and crying and pain. And it's tough. Dawson McAllister says the main reason we get mad at God is because we think he owes us something, usually to give us the things we want or to protect us from things we don't want. And sometimes when we're mad at God, or maybe we downplay it and say we're just disappointed in God, it's because we've forgotten that this world is not our home. The old hymn, we don't sing the old hymns as much, but the old hymn said, this world's not our home. We're just passing through. And we don't live today. I don't live today as if I'm passing through. I live as if this is it. This is my home. And the old hymn said, you can't feel at home in this world anymore. And if we had a little more of that mindset, I think it would make us be a little less disappointed when things here don't do the things we think they ought to do. The Bible speaks so candidly about this. 2 Corinthians 4 says, we now have this light shining in our hearts, talking about the gospel, but it's not all easy, but we ourselves are like fragile clay jars containing this great treasure. This love of God, this message of God. This makes it clear that our great power is from God, not from ourselves. The Bible says we're like fragile clay jars. God is not fragile, but we're fragile. Life is fragile. Culture is fragile. Our world is fragile. Have you had any moment in the last months where you said, I think this may all fall apart. I don't know if the center's going to hold on this thing, whether it's virus or economy or political. I'm not sure this is pretty fragile. And we like to think in America it's not fragile. It's fragile. Life's fragile. Your life's fragile. So is mine. Because this world's not our home. 2 Corinthians goes on in verse 8 to say, we're pressed on every side by troubles. I feel that, but we're not crushed. We're perplexed, we're not driven to despair. We're hunted down, but never abandoned by God. We get knocked down, but we're not destroyed. When life turns you from pleasant to bitter, when you have that one more thing, one thing too far, and then one thing after that, and one thing after that, remember that you've never been abandoned by God, ever. Never. You may be pressed on every side, but God won't let it crush you. You may be perplexed, you may be confused, you may be bewildered, but don't go to despair because you're not alone. You've never been abandoned by God. Ruth and Naomi were never abandoned by God once. Author John Ortberg says, any crisis carries in its wake the question, what can I build my life on that circumstances cannot rob me of? What really matters. If 2020 is anything, it's a crisis. And 2020 should teach us, please church, let it teach us that we can't build our life upon so many of these things we've been building our life upon. And I can almost guarantee you, that if you're mad at God today, and I'm sure some of you are, or disappointed, or whatever word you want to use, it's because you're on the backside of a crisis where something was ripped out from underneath you that you were leaning on. And it hurts when that thing you're leaning on gets ripped out from underneath you. And in those moments, you've got to ask yourself, candidly, painfully, honestly, what am I building my life upon? Because I think maybe the reason I'm in pain is because I was leaning on something that wasn't designed to be leaned on. We live in a broken world, far too broken to serve as a foundation for your life. Let me just, prophecy is not some voodoo thing. Prophecy is saying, if you keep going this way, here's where you're going to end up. And the Bible gives us clarity on these things. So let me just give you some prophecy. If you keep building your life upon your career, it will disappoint you eventually. Every time. If you build your life on a relationship in this world, even a good one, it's going to let you down at some point. The world's broken. If you build your life on your finances or your family or your health, eventually it's going to be taken out from underneath you and it's going to let you down. Nothing in this fragile world can be built upon as a foundation ultimately for your life. God's the only one who can do that. And if you lean on anything else as your primary foundation, it's going to be ripped out from underneath you because this world's broken. This world is not our home. And Naomi discovered that. It's one thing after the other got ripped out from underneath her life, and she went from pleasant to bitter. And maybe you're in this season right now where you've had some things ripped out from underneath you, and you used to be pleasant, and you don't even recognize yourself anymore. You're feeling very bitter. If that's true, I want you to know that only God is strong enough to be that foundation for you. But here's the temptation. When those things get ripped out from underneath you, that hurts. And we're tempted to say, the Almighty has made me bitter. And if you're not careful, you're going to push away the only person who can be the foundation that you need. And that's the Lord Jesus, your Creator God. He can be the foundation, but because of your bitterness, you're going to push that one possible foundation away. Don't let that be true of you. He's the only one who's going to be there to wipe away every tear from your eye. He's the one who's going to make all things new. So there'll be no more mourning or crying or pain. He's the one who's going to do that, so don't push him away. First misunderstanding is that the world is not broken. Second misunderstanding is that God should always act in a way that makes sense to me. You know, we just got through an election, and I, for one, am grateful that the election is over. Yeah, exactly right. Whether the person won that you wanted to win or didn't, either way, I'm glad it's over. And in elections, here's what we do. In elections, we say, okay, I'm going to give somebody, some man or woman, my vote so they can have the authority that I don't have and the responsibility that I don't want, and I'm going to pick them because they agree with me. So they'll do in that position what I would do if I was in that position, but I don't want to be in that position, so I'm going to vote for them to do in that position what I would do, right? That's what you do. It works well in a democracy, but God is not the head of a democracy. You can't vote for God. He's not trying to be our president. He says he's our king. And you can agree with that or disagree with that, accept it or deny it, but it doesn't change the fact that he's God. And eventually, every knee is going to bow, every single one, including all of ours, those who voted for him and those who did not. But he's not asking for our vote. He's asking for our life. And he's not offering us his plan and agenda. He's offering us his son. So you cannot put God in the same box that you put every other leader in. He's not the same. And that means that God's not always going to make sense to you, and God certainly doesn't always make sense to me. But let me give you some assurances there. You don't want him to. Because if I can make God make sense to me in every single situation, he's not big enough to do the stuff I need him to do. I need God to understand things that I don't understand. I need God to be able to do things I can't do. I need God to be able to lead me through and fix things that I can't see my way through. And if he makes sense to me every time, he can't do that. But if he's big enough to do those things, he's going to be big enough to understand things and see things that I don't understand. And that's okay because he's trustworthy. And if you can't understand God right now, trust him and follow him because he's a good God who will see you through. You know, if you're in the middle of it right now, let me just say to you, I've been a pastor a long time, which means that I've walked alongside of somebody dealing with about every kind of pain and brokenness this world has to offer. So I've seen it. It doesn't surprise me much anymore. And so if you're in the middle of it right now and what you're going through doesn't make sense, I want you to know God didn't necessarily cause it. Maybe somebody else's sin caused it or bad decisions. Maybe your sin caused it or bad decisions. Maybe there's a lot of options of how you got there. Maybe God may not be causing it, but he's big enough to handle it. And he's smart enough to see you through it. And he's wise enough to lead you out of it. But your goal, your job, is to be brave enough to stick with him as he goes. Because he won't drag you out of it, but he'll offer you his hand. And if you cling to God, he'll walk you through. He'll get you out. But you got to be brave enough to keep hold of his hand. So I want to ask you, even if you don't understand what God's doing, even if you don't understand what's happening in your world, I want to ask you to be brave enough to stick close to God. Especially if you don't understand, stick close to God. Because he won't always make sense. and that's okay. The third misunderstanding, our world's not broken. It is. God should always make sense. He doesn't. The third misunderstanding, and probably the most common, but the one you're going to want to deny in your own life, is that God cannot be trusted. Satan's just not all that creative. This is his go-to. This is his fastball all the way through. You can't trust God. At the root of all of his lies is a steady refrain that you can't trust God, you can't trust God, you can't trust God. And he's trying to convince you of that, even probably right now. He told Adam and Eve, God was wrong about the fruit, can't trust him. He told Sarah, God will never give you a baby, you can't trust him. He told Gideon, God's not strong enough to get you through unless you've got a bigger army, can't trust him. And I don't know what example he's trying to sell you, but I promise you, at the root of it is this sense that you can't trust God, he's not trustworthy. But I want you to trust him, because if you can win that battle, everything else falls in line. If you miss it there, and Satan knows that, if you miss it there, everything else begins to unravel. Listen to these words from David, Ruth's great-grandson, as he describes how we should handle these moments. Psalm 66 says, come and see what God has done, what awesome miracles he performs for people. I think David's saying, listen, if you're in the middle of it and everything's up close and it's personal and it's hard, you've got to step back a minute and come and see the landscape. And if you're not in the middle of it right now, let me tell you, from the landscape, when you step back out of the forest, you can see the trees. And when you step back and notice all the movements of God, it gives you perspective to the thing you're in right now. So if you can't see that, just trust me. There's more going on than what you're facing right now. It goes on in verse 9 and says, our lives are in his hands, and he keeps our feet from stumbling. It says, you, God, have tested us. You have purified us like silver. Now, I love it when the Bible does this. That sounds so poetic, doesn't it? You have purified us like silver. It gives you the warm fuzzies. Like Thomas Kincaid, if he hadn't drawn something about that, he needs to draw something about that, like a stream or I don't know, something, right? Something peaceful. But how do you purify silver? Lots of heat, quite a bit of stirring, a good bit of scraping, and lots more heat. And you just repeat that over and over and over. And some of you are getting scraped on right now. A few years ago, I started going back to the gym. I hadn't been for a long, long time. I started going back to the gym, and the next day, I had parts of me that hurt that I didn't even know I had. Like there's things in me, I didn't know that was a thing, and it's sore. Like I know it's there now because it's sore. And some of you are being purified like silver right now, and you're having things scraped off of you that you didn't even know you had. And it hurts, and stuff's being yanked out from underneath you, but it's okay because God has never abandoned you. He's purifying you, but he's never abandoned you. There's more. Verse 12 says, we went through fire and flood, but you brought us to a place of great abundance. God brings us through. And if you're in the fire and flood right now, it may be hard to see what it's going to be like on the other side of the fire and flood, but there's another side to the fire and flood. And on the other side of this season, you're going to be glad you didn't give up on our God, because he's never given up on you. And on the back side of the season you're walking through, God's going to be there still. And you're going to be so glad that you can look back at this moment and say with integrity, I never gave up on God. God, you brought me through it. I faced it. It was hard. It was nasty. I didn't know where you were doing. I didn't know where I was going, but I never gave up on you, and you never gave up on me. You want to be able to look back to today and say that. I guarantee it. And so you've got to just keep going today. Keep trying today. Keep clinging to God today, because he's never given up on you, and he's never left you alone. And you're going to be able to say, God, you brought me to a place of great abundance, just like David did. But you can only say that if you don't give up, if you keep a hold of his hand. Verse 16 says, come and listen, all you who fear God, and I will tell you what he did for me. If you have experienced walking with God, you don't need me to tell you anything here. Because you remember, I was in this mess and God brought me through. I was in this mess and God brought me through. I was in this mess and God brought me through. You've got experience with God, so you don't need my experience to tell you that if I just stick with God, he's going to see me through. But if you're new to this, or if the thing you're facing is extra hard, you need some extra assurances that he's going to see you through. Can I be that for you? God's going to see you through. He always does. And it's going to be confusing in a bit. It's going to be hard in a bit. There's going to be some purifying and some scraping and but God's going to see you through. And on the backside of this moment, you're going to be closer to God than you are now. And that's worth all of it. You're going to be stronger than ever. We're going to look at Ruth and Naomi's stories next couple of weeks, but let me jump to the bottom line conclusion. It gets better. It's really hard right now. She's gone from pleasant to bitter right now, but it's going to get better. And God brings them to a place of great abundance, just like Ruth's great-grandson said that he would. And God is central to their story. I want you to know Naomi's God. I want you to know Ruth's God because he's my God. And he can be your God. And he died to make that possible. And if you don't know God, not just know about God, if you don't know God, I desperately need you to know him. And if you're in the middle of it right now and nothing makes sense, he'll make sense. But you've got to have him as your foundation for anything else to build on. And if you're at the bottom, if you've dug a hole and you're at the bottom, the best place to build a foundation is at the bottom. So if you're at the bottom, stop digging your hole and put a foundation underneath you that's sure and certain. It's not a relationship. It's not a career. It's not a change in environment. It's the Lord. And you put him underneath you at the bottom of that hole, and he will lead you out of that hole to a place of great abundance. But you got to come to know Naomi's God, and you got to come to know Ruth's God because he's my God, and I want him to be your God. And if you've gotten distracted by life, if you got distracted by all the dirt and the digging, man, I want him for you. Won't you bow your head? Let's pray together. God, I certainly don't know what you have in mind today, but I feel it. I didn't know anything about it when I was writing this, but you did. And I feel like the air is thick with something. So God, whatever it is that you have in mind, I pray that I wouldn't get in the way of it. I pray we wouldn't distract ourselves out of it. But we'd stay in this moment until you're done with us. And God, I just sense that there's some who used to be pleasant who feel very bitter right now. And they need the foundation that only you can provide for their life. So God, we open ourselves up to you, and we invite you into our story. We invite you into our pain. We invite you into our hurt. We invite you into our confusion. We invite you in to lead our life. And we'll say that lightly. We invite you in to lead our life. Forgive us of our sins through the blood of your Son, Jesus, who died for us, who rose again to life, defeating death and the grave and hell for us. And God, I pray that you would come into our life, that we'd sense you, we'd see you, we'd run to you. If we're too hurt and wounded, we'd limp to you. But God, we would come and we would offer ourselves, all of it, good, bad, and ugly, to you. And I know what happens on the backside of that prayer. So I pray we'd make it. God, you're welcome in me. I pray in Jesus' name.